Let's continue our conversation on Stoicism, and I wanted to take a 1 week break from Seneca because I got a question on one of the Stoicism videos that very much appealed to me for reasons that will become clear very quickly. Someone asked, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but is there a sort of common denominator among all methods that treat mental health, which includes psychology, which may include specific forms of, or specific teachings, I should say, within Buddhism, which includes Stoicism. And when you think about it, these are all methods to work on mental health. And the person who asked the question said, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to me that what pretty much all those specific approaches have in common is something that I believe it was a he, labeled perspective shift. So kind of switching your perspective on things. And I thought that was a very interesting question. I am a psychologist. I just, in case you don't know, but I'm not a clinical psychologist. So I do not deal with patients. I do not give therapy. I am a cognitive psychologist, so I focus on something else than helping people. Having said that, there is some attention in every psychologist's education for therapeutical interventions because you need to know a little bit about that, even if you're not a clinician. So having said that, I thought it was a very interesting question. And having said that, you might be interested to know that one of the most effective, just evidence-based, science-based, most effective forms of psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, in a way was actually based on Stoic principles, among some other philosophical principles. So I thought that maybe as a little bit of a change of pace from going over another letter by Seneca, we could try today to explore that relationship a little bit. If you find it particularly interesting, there is a very good book that I wanted to grab and I forgot, but it is by Donald Robertson on the influence of Stoicism on cognitive therapy, which is very interesting. I'll try to post the link to that book in the description of the video. So, in a nutshell, we can speculate a lot on how Stoicism spread across the world, because it is for sure true that certain principles that figure largely in Stoicism also figure in Buddhism, for example. There even are some theories that maybe Stoicism spread to specific parts of Asia where it may or may not have influenced Buddhist teachings. As far as I know, that link has never been unequivocally established. So I don't really want to speculate on that because I do think that would be speculation. It's possible that people traveled and they took this knowledge. Yeah, that's possible. It's also possible that didn't happen. And these are just parallel streams of, in certain ways, similar and in certain ways also very different schools of philosophy and approaches to life. So I don't really want to focus on that, but I did want to focus on the psychological aspect of all this. One of the more, I would say, colorful characters in modern day psychology is Albert Ellis. Ellis with E-L-L-I-S. Sorry. This is my instruction nature that comes out. Albert Ellis was a clinical psychologist, very fun guy to watch. He was very outspoken in interviews, but I think in an interesting way, who always rebelled a little bit against the establishment. And Ellis came up with a type of psychotherapy called rational emotive therapy or rational emotive behavioral therapy. And he has always been quite open about the idea that he was very interested in philosophy in his younger years, and pretty much explained how, because he wasn't very successful with girls, he developed the whole principles of rational emotive therapy to try and be more confident. And that turned into a whole therapy, of which he was the main proponent, but a lot of people over the years have been trained in that specific perspective. Now, rational emotive therapy, when I start to describe this, if you've seen some of the other videos on Stoicism, I'm sure you'll immediately notice a couple of parallels. So, RET, rational emotive therapy, rational emotive behavioral therapy, was really, I think, designed to deal with neurotic behavior, which is not necessarily a term we use a whole lot anymore, but dealing with specific issues like, say, depression and anxiety. And what rational emotive behavioral therapy proposes in its simplest form, and I do want to keep this a little concise, is something that Ellis would call the ABC model. And the A, B, and C stand for there is some sort of adversity, something negative that happens to you, then there is a certain belief that you have about that situation, and then there is a consequence. So, for example, I've used this example a couple of times, but I think it's a naturally appealing one that we can all easily get behind. You get fired. You lose your job. That is a certain adversity. And then about that adversity, you may have certain beliefs. For example, this is a complete failure. Everything is now lost. Now nothing will work out. I will be on the street, etc. And that's the consequence. The consequence will then be that you feel bad. How could you not feel bad if you have those kinds of beliefs about what is going on? And Ellis, reaching back to a couple of philosophical schools, but definitely Stoicism, said, but now you make a thinking error. You are assuming that something goes wrong. And if I remember correctly, the term catastrophizing is one from Ellis. He came up with that. And he says that's what you do. You catastrophize. You could also take a step back, and there is also a D, E, and F in this model, but I'll keep it a little brief. You can take a step back. You can question your beliefs. And then the whole point of RET is that it's not just the adversity, but it's also the belief that contributes strongly to the consequence. So if you start to feel depressed, now I'm not necessarily talking about clinical depression where you need medication, those kinds of things. I'm talking about feeling bad about something that happens that kind of takes over your thought processes. Those are consequences, and they're caused not just by the event that happens, but also by your beliefs about that event. So if you can learn to take a step back mentally and assess those beliefs, see if those beliefs are really rational, in other words, in the context of that type of therapy, if they really help you to advance in life, to lead a fulfilling, satisfying life, then you're fine. But if those thoughts are not rational, if they are more problematic, then there will be problems. You will feel bad. You will feel upset. You may feel frustrated, anxious, depressed, etc. So the point of rational emotive behavioral therapy is to kind of counteract those beliefs, to teach someone to take that mental step back and assess whether what you believe about a certain situation is also true. And the simple example here would be, okay, I have lost my job. Maybe instead of catastrophizing and thinking it's the end of the world, I can accept that this is a bad situation, that I would rather not be in this situation, that I have a little bit of a right to be upset about it, who wouldn't be? But that I can also start to work towards finding a solution, such as applying for new jobs. Or I can look at my situation from the perspective of, actually, maybe I never really liked that job, or my colleagues, or my boss, or whatever there is. And as a result, it may actually be, in ways, a positive thing that I've lost this job and that I can now move on in my life. Obviously, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but I'm sure you understand the basic idea of what I'm trying to convey. You challenge those beliefs. Sorry, they're shoveling snow out there if you hear weird noises. You challenge the beliefs that you have, and as a result, you may start to feel better, because it is not the thing itself that bothers you, but your thoughts about that thing. This is reasoning that you find in Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. This is reasoning you find in Epictetus and his discourses, as well as the Enchiridion. So this should sound very familiar. And you can see here the very clear commonality between REBT and Stoicism. Indeed, it is a change in perspective. You can't change necessarily the situation. If you get fired, you cannot make yourself be unfired, but you can change the way you think about that situation, and as a result, move forward in life. Out of rational emotive behavioral therapy, because you don't necessarily find a whole lot of clinical psychologists, therapists, counselors who use RET anymore, but out of RET came another type of psychotherapy, cognitive therapy, developed by Aaron Beck. And that is a type of therapy that was really designed to work with depression, but it turns out to be pretty effective for other types of what we call psychopathologies as well. So not just depression, also anxiety can be useful in obsessive compulsive disorder, can be useful in a number of different pathologies. Cognitive therapy evolved into cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses not only on cognition, and this is said non-judgmentally, but faulty thinking, right? As I just described in RET, you will see the parallel. It's not the thing itself, but how you think about something that can affect how you feel, right? But there is also typically a behavioral component to that type of therapy. So I think a good example of correcting errors in someone's thinking that may lead to problems is the distinction between internalizing and externalizing behavior. Healthy thoughts that don't make you feel terrible, typically fall somewhere in between fully internalizing and fully externalizing. Let's take the context of an exam that you have to write. Some people, when they fully internalize, right, they fail an exam and then they say, yeah, that's because I'm a complete failure. I can't do anything right. I always get it wrong. And that's internalizing behavior. You will not be surprised to learn that typically is associated with depression and with anxiety, right? You put the blame fully on you. Externalizing behavior is the opposite. We say, well, it's not my fault. The exam was too hard. Nobody can write this, right? That's not fully healthy either. Right? Somewhere in the middle of that is probably reality. Maybe you could have studied a little bit harder. Maybe you studied the wrong things. Maybe the exam was not what you expected, etc. Right? But that's somewhere in the middle. So you can learn, if you are an internalizer, to think, well, instead of immediately saying that this is all my fault, that I have failed, that I can never do anything right, maybe that's not the case at all. Maybe that's a thought that needs to be challenged. And if you learn to effectively challenge that type of thought, then you will progress more and you will feel better. And I think that can be incredibly helpful as well. And that is an aspect of the cognitive side of cognitive behavioral therapy that I think can be very helpful. When you talk about the more behavioral aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy, you can think of things like monitoring behavior, and something that CBT psychologists typically call behavioral activation. So, for example, you can really try to think about how much pleasure doing a certain thing gives you, or how big of a sense of accomplishment you get from certain things. So, in other words, what you are doing, snow shoveling, what you are doing is, again, examining your thoughts and examining your behaviors. And a therapist who is trained in this type of therapy can help you to challenge non-productive thoughts, to challenge non-productive behaviors, and try to put things back on the rail together with you so that you start to feel better. What's interesting about cognitive behavioral therapy is that, especially I should initially say cognitive therapy, what Aaron Beck came up with, also has been founded a little bit on rational emotive therapy, but also, again, Beck does refer to specific philosophers. For example, people from Stoicism, but also people like Cicero, who were also kind of Stoic, but were a bit eclectic, but who did write on Stoicism. So it's interesting that I think the person who asked the question absolutely correctly pointed out that if you just look at these three things, there's RET, there is CBT, and there is Stoicism, that the idea of changing your perspective, changing your thoughts about something can be an incredibly helpful way to feel better. I genuinely believe that, and I've myself experienced in a lot of situations that can make a massive difference. Because again, if you can't change the situation, maybe you can change the way you think about that situation. And that, I do believe, can be very helpful. So that perspective shift does figure quite largely into a lot of different schools of thought that are involved in helping people, trying to change the way they think, the way they look at things. And it is fascinating that both Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck acknowledged that ancient philosophy, whether it's Greek or Roman, or at least represented by a Roman in the case of Cicero, but that those kinds of ancient philosophy have been relevant in their development of modern-day psychotherapeutic approaches. And I find it quite fascinating to think that something like cognitive behavioral therapy, which again and again is shown to be a very effective type of therapy, is at least a little bit grounded in philosophy that is a few thousand years old. And it still works. The principles still work. So if you ever feel a need to have more of an empirical support for the idea of Stoicism, look at those types of therapy, which have been shown to be really quite effective in dealing with specific psychological issues. I thought that was an interesting question. I hope that you also thought that was an interesting question, and that this reasoning made some sense, and that you feel that this was useful and insightful. I will gladly see you again next week for more talk about Stoicism. Bye!